It was a chilly autumn evening when I heard the knock at the door. The sound itself wasn't unusual. I was used to the quiet rhythm of daily life with my wife. The occasional delivery, the neighbor stopping by, but that night, the knock sent a strange feeling through me, as though my body knew before my mind what was coming. I opened the door slowly, unsure of what to expect. Standing there, half shadowed by the dim porch light, was a man. He was tall, with dark hair and a face that looked both familiar and foreign. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't even move, and then, just as I started to catch my bearings, he smiled, a faint, small curve that lit his face like the remnants of a long-dimmed fire. "Come on, give your brother a hug," he said, and before I knew it, his arms were around me. It was a tight hug, one filled with warmth, a sensation so overwhelming that I felt numb to it. I let him hold me, but I couldn't bring myself to feel it. I had told myself years ago he was gone for good, a mystery I'd never solve, a piece of myself I'd lost forever. Yet here he was, holding on to me like it was just yesterday that he'd walked out of our lives. I should have felt something: joy, anger, relief, anything but the numbness hung over me like a fog, clouding every thought, every feeling. The brother I'd spent years trying to find, the brother I cried for, was standing in front of me, and I felt nothing. Somehow, I invited him inside, motioning for him to sit across from me on the worn couch my wife and I had bought when we moved into this house. He sat quietly, glancing around the room as though trying to piece together who I'd become in his absence. I couldn't bring myself to do the same. I just stared at him, waiting for something to click, for something to wake up inside me, but nothing came. It was only after we exchanged a few polite formalities that I realized I hadn't taken a single moment to actually look at him. I took in the lines on his face, the slight graying in his hair, the way his eyes looked a little more guarded, a little more worn than the ones I remembered. And yet, despite the years, I still saw the face of my brother, my best friend, the only person who ever really knew me, the boy who had left without a trace 17 years ago. He was the first to break the silence, asking me about my life, my work, my wife, things so normal that they felt absurd. I answered as best I could, feeling like I was on autopilot, like I was a stranger in my own body. Then, unable to stop myself, I blurted out the question that had haunted me for over a decade: "Why didn't you reach out? I spent years looking for you. I thought you were dead." I thought. The words caught in my throat. It was too much, too fast. I felt my face flush with a mix of shame and anger. But he didn't flinch. He just looked at me. His eyes softened with something I couldn't quite name, and said, "It was never the right time." The right time. It echoed in my head like a bitter joke. 17 years of my life had been spent in the shadow of his absence. In a hollow where I kept my pain and all the memories of our life together. The endless nights I lay awake, haunted by the image of him alone somewhere, hurt or worse, while I raged against the walls of my empty room. 17 years of wondering if he'd forgotten me or if he'd left me on purpose. And he sat there, calm and collected, talking about the right time, as if it was just a missed dinner date. I wanted to ask him more, to tear into him, to demand an answer that might make sense of the years he'd stolen from me. But I held back, afraid of what he might say, or worse, afraid he wouldn't say anything at all. So we let the conversation drift to safer ground, skimming over the surface of our lives as though there wasn't an ocean of unresolved grief and anger between us. When he finally rose to leave, he gave me a piece of paper with his address on it. "I'm here if you want to talk," he said softly. There was a gentleness in his voice, almost a plea, but it did nothing to ease the tension knotted in my chest. I watched him walk down the steps and disappear into the night, feeling a strange sense of loss, as though he was slipping through my fingers all over again. As I closed the door behind him, I felt the numbness recede, replaced by the sharp sting of anger. I was angry at him for leaving, angry at him for coming back, and angriest of all at myself for the faint hope that still lingered. That somehow, after all this time, we might find a way back to each other. I spent the next few days replaying the encounter in my mind, dissecting every word, every look. I couldn't escape the flood of memories that came with seeing him again. Each one opened old wounds I thought I'd buried for good, the memories of our childhood. Our parents, the silent alliance we'd formed to survive in a household where love was something that could only be spoken about in sermons. I remembered our last conversation before he disappeared, the way he seemed so defeated, so utterly broken after coming out to our parents. I remembered watching helplessly as he bore the brunt of their anger, their hatred cloaked in piety, and how I'd stood by, too scared to defend him, too scared to become their next target. A part of me had hoped that if I ever saw him again, I'd find some peace, some closure, but instead, I was left with more questions, a fresh wave of anger, and the bitter taste of regret. Why had he waited so long? Why had he left me to face them alone? Did he even think of me in those years he was gone? Or had he left me behind as easily as he'd left everything else? And then, there was the question that gnawed at me most, could I ever forgive him? Or was the bond we once shared lost for good, buried under years of silence and abandonment? My wife noticed the change in me. She'd been with me through the darkest years of my grief. The years when I'd held on to hope like a lifeline. The years when I'd finally learned to let go. But even she couldn't understand what it felt like to be torn open all over again. To be faced with the ghost of my past and the chance at reconciliation I wasn't sure I wanted. I wanted to forgive him. I wanted to understand, but part of me was still that 15-year-old boy, standing in the doorway, watching his brother walk away without a word, without a backward glance. The paper with his address sat on my desk for days, taunting me. Every time I looked at it, I felt the familiar ache, the longing I'd buried years ago. I knew that if I went to see him, there would be no going back. I would have to confront the pain I'd locked away, the anger I'd nursed like a wound, and the faint, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to forgive each other. And so, I found myself at a crossroads, caught between the desire to let him back in and the fear of reopening wounds I'd only just begun to heal. In the end, I knew there was only one way forward. If I wanted any peace, I would have to face the past, face him, and face the parts of myself I'd hidden from for so long. With a deep breath, I picked up the paper, and for the first time in 17 years, I let myself hope. The day I decided to visit my brother, I felt a strange weight lift from me, as if making the decision alone granted me some power over the memories I'd been avoiding. But with each mile on the road, that weight crept back, heavier than ever. I could almost feel the years rolling back, inching me closer to a time I'd fought so hard to leave behind. The address he'd given me was in a small town a few hours from where I lived. As I drove, I remembered the last time I'd traveled this far with a sense of purpose. It was years ago. During one of my many failed searches for him. Back then, I'd followed every lead, clung to every shred of hope, desperate to find even a hint of where he'd gone. And with every dead end, I felt a little more of myself slip away. Eventually, I stopped searching, and with time, I learned to live without the answers. But now, the questions had returned, louder than ever. What had he been doing all these years? Had he thought of me? Was there a life he'd built without me? One where I had no place? Part of me dreaded the answers. I feared he'd moved on in a way I hadn't. That he'd let me go the way I'd tried to let him go. Maybe seeing him again would reveal just how different we'd become. That the brother I remembered was gone for good. The town he lived in was quiet. The kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and lives followed a predictable rhythm. I imagined him here, living a simple, peaceful life. And I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. I hadn't had peace in years, even after I'd given up the search. His memory clung to me like a ghost. There were times when I caught myself looking for him in crowds, flinching whenever I saw someone who looked just a little like him. I wondered if he'd ever done the same. When I pulled into his street, my heart raced. His house was modest, with a small porch and a garden that looked lovingly cared for. I wondered if he had a family now. If he'd found the acceptance here that he'd never had back home. I sat in the car for a long time, watching his house, letting the reality sink in. This was where he'd chosen to disappear to, where he'd rebuilt himself while I was left to pick up the pieces. Finally, I forced myself out of the car, my hands trembling as I approached his door. Standing there, I felt like a stranger again, like I was intruding on something private. But before I could second-guess myself, the door opened. He must have seen me pull up, and he stood there, looking as uncertain as I felt. He gestured for me to come in, his smile softer than the one he'd given me at my own door. This time, though, I saw a hint of something else in his eyes, maybe relief. Maybe hope. I wasn't sure, but it gave me the courage to step inside. His home was small but comfortable, filled with the kind of warmth I'd never known growing up. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the tables covered in framed photographs. And there was a sense of life here, of belonging, that felt foreign to me. For a moment, I felt a sharp pang of resentment. This was the life he'd made without me, a life where I'd been replaced by new people, new memories. I knew it was irrational, but part of me couldn't help but feel betrayed. I took in every detail. cataloging each one as though it might reveal something about the brother I'd lost. Then, almost as if to distract me, he motioned to the kitchen. He had prepared coffee, and as he poured 2 cups, I realized that I'd forgotten what his movements looked like, the way he carried himself. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be here with him, as though no time had passed and we were just 2 brothers catching up after a long day. The silence between us was thick, filled with everything we weren't saying. He handed me a cup, and I took a slow sip, letting the warmth seep into me, grounding me. My eyes drifted to a photograph on the wall, a candid shot of him with a group of friends. Laughing, carefree. I recognized none of them, yet they seemed to know him in ways I no longer did. It was a reminder of how much time had passed, of how he'd built a life I hadn't been a part of. "I like your home," I said finally, the words feeling hollow as they left my mouth. It was true, I did like it, but what I really wanted to say was that I hated that it existed without me. That he had gone on to live a life that I knew nothing about. But I kept those words buried, knowing they'd only cause more pain. He nodded, glancing around the room as though seeing it through my eyes. "It took time to build," he said softly, his voice distant, almost regretful. I could feel the weight of everything he wasn't saying. The years of silence that stretched between us. It was strange, hearing him talk about his life like this, as though I were a stranger, as though the years we'd spent together were nothing more than a distant memory. And then, almost as if he sensed my thoughts, he began to talk about the day he left. His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness to it, a sadness that seemed to bleed into every word. He didn't go into detail. He didn't need to. I knew enough of our parents' cruelty to fill in the blanks. But he spoke of the guilt, the shame, the feeling of being unwanted and unloved. He told me of the night he walked out, of the fear that he might never find a place to call home, that he might always be running. I sat in silence, listening, trying to absorb the weight of his words. I felt a flicker of anger at the memories, a fresh surge of resentment toward our parents, and even a sting of guilt for all the times I'd wondered why he hadn't reached out to me. I'd always thought he'd chosen to leave me, but now, hearing him speak, I realized that maybe he'd had no choice at all. When he finished, he looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and I saw the same question reflected back at me, the same fear, the same regret. We were both haunted by the past, by the memories of what we'd lost and the lives we'd built in its wake. And in that moment, I felt a strange sense of kinship, as though we were bound by our pain, by the scars our parents had left on us. The silence stretched on, and I realized that there was nothing left to say. I had come here seeking answers, but instead, I had found a kind of understanding. I didn't need him to explain every detail of the years he'd spent away. Nor did I need to demand an apology for the pain he'd caused me. In some strange way, I felt that he had already paid the price for his absence, just as I had paid mine. As I left his house that day, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling I hadn't known in years. I didn't know what the future held for us, or if we'd ever truly be brothers again, but I knew that I could finally let go of the anger, the resentment, the questions that had plagued me for so long. And as I drove away, I realized that forgiveness didn't have to be a grand gesture, or even a spoken word. Sometimes, forgiveness was simply the act of letting go, of accepting the past and allowing yourself to move forward. And in that moment, I felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that, at last, I was free. Driving back, I found myself both lighter and strangely lost. The visit had given me a sense of closure, but it also left me with an emptiness I hadn't expected. All those years, I'd built my life around the idea of him being gone, a mystery I might never solve. And now, with him back, I had to confront the reality that my life, shaped so deeply by his absence, was changed in a way I couldn't yet understand. The following days passed in a blur, as if time itself was urging me to process everything at my own pace. My wife, sensitive as always, didn't press for details. She gave me space, yet her quiet presence reminded me that I wasn't alone in this. She'd been with me through years of sleepless nights and restless searching. Through the tears and frustrations, she knew what it had meant to lose him, to let him go, and now, to see him again. The calm she offered me was grounding, like a tether to reality, and I found myself more grateful for her than I'd been in years. The memory of my brother's home lingered in my mind, filling me with conflicting emotions. The simplicity of his life, the warmth of his living space, it was everything our own childhood home had lacked. Growing up, our house had been dark, cold, full of whispered prayers and strict rules. It was never a place for laughter, for joy, or for dreams. But his home was different, a testament to the life he'd built out of the ashes of our shared trauma. It was hard to admit that I envied him. He'd walked away from that darkness, had the courage to start over, to find a place where he could be himself. Meanwhile, I'd been left to face the consequences, to suffer the wrath of our parents after he disappeared. I carried those memories like scars, worn and faded but still visible if you looked closely enough. And now, I had to reckon with the realization that he'd managed to heal. While I still carried the weight of our past, my thoughts often drifted to the moments we'd shared as kids. The secret exchanges, the quiet rebellion against a household where emotions were forbidden. He was the first person I'd ever trusted, my first real friend. We had our own world, hidden in stolen glances and whispered jokes. A world where we could be ourselves, away from our parents' judgment and the constant shadow of expectation. But that world had shattered the day he came out. I still remembered the look in his eyes, the vulnerability and defiance that had both terrified and inspired me. He had dared to tell the truth, and for that, he had been punished. I watched him bear the brunt of our parents' fury, unable to do anything, too afraid to face their wrath myself. I hated myself for it, even now, for the silence that I'd hidden behind while he'd suffered alone. And yet, sitting here in the comfort of my own home, I wondered if maybe I'd misjudged him all these years. Maybe he hadn't left me behind on purpose. Maybe he'd simply been doing what he needed to survive. I realized that he'd probably been just as scared as I was. That his departure wasn't a betrayal, but a desperate act of self-preservation. It was a thought that gave me a strange sense of relief. Though the sting of abandonment still lingered, the days turned into weeks. And slowly, I began to feel a sense of peace. I no longer looked for answers in his absence. No longer felt the same urgency to know why he'd stayed away. Instead, I found myself looking inward, questioning the life I'd built and the choices I'd made. My brother had forced me to confront a part of myself I'd buried. A part that still bore the scars of our past. And now, I had to decide what to do with it. One evening, as I sat with my wife, I found myself talking about our childhood for the first time in years. I told her stories of the games we'd played, the mischief we'd managed despite our parents' strict rules, and the small acts of kindness my brother had shown me, the moments that had kept me going. She listened, her eyes soft, her hand resting on mine, and I felt a strange sense of comfort in sharing these memories with her. It was as if, by bringing them into the light, I was finally able to see them for what they were, pieces of a past I could acknowledge without letting it control me. In those quiet moments, I realized that forgiveness wasn't something I could simply give my brother. It was something I had to give myself, too. I had to forgive myself for the years I'd spent blaming him, for the anger I'd harbored, and for the guilt that had weighed on me since the day he left. I had to let go of the idea that his absence was a punishment, an abandonment, and accept that we'd both done what we needed to survive. I thought about reaching out to him, about making an effort to rebuild our relationship, but a part of me was still hesitant, still afraid of reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. I knew that reconnecting with him would require vulnerability, honesty, and a willingness to face the pain we'd both endured. I wasn't sure I was ready for that, not yet. Instead, I took small steps. I started with little things, like writing down memories of our childhood, documenting the moments that had shaped me, both the good and the bad. It became a ritual, a way of honoring the parts of myself I'd hidden for so long. And as I wrote, I felt a strange sense of liberation, as if I were finally giving myself permission to feel, to grieve, and to move forward. There were days when the memories were too much, when I'd feel the weight of it all pressing down on me, suffocating in its intensity. But then, I'd remind myself of my brother's home, of the life he'd built, and I'd feel a renewed sense of hope. If he could find peace, if he could create a life out of the darkness we'd shared, then maybe I could too. In the end, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a destination, but a journey. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about accepting it, embracing it, and allowing it to become a part of who I was. My brother had taught me that, without even trying, and in a way, his return had given me the freedom to finally let go, to finally begin the process of healing. One evening, I found myself standing at the door, staring out into the fading light. I thought about all the nights I'd waited for him to come home, all the years I'd spent hoping for a reunion I'd convinced myself would never happen. And now, after everything, I felt a sense of calm, a quiet acceptance that I hadn't known before. In time, I knew I'd reach out to him again. I'd find a way to rebuild our connection, to bridge the years we'd lost. But for now, I was content to simply let things be, to let the wounds heal in their own time. I'd made peace with the past, and for the first time, I felt ready to face the future. As the last traces of daylight faded, I closed the door, feeling a strange, steady warmth in my chest. It wasn't joy, exactly, but something close, a gentle reminder that, even after all the pain and loss, there was still room for hope, for healing, and for a new beginning. The idea of reconnecting with my brother didn't come all at once. It grew slowly, like a seed planted somewhere deep inside, nurtured by memories, reflections, and the quiet acceptance that had finally begun to settle in. Some nights, I found myself staring at the address he'd given me, wondering if I was ready to take that next step. I'd imagine the possibilities, the conversations we might have, the stories he might share, but the thought always brought a wave of anxiety too, an uncertain fear that I couldn't quite shake. In the days that followed our first meeting, I'd catch myself reaching for the phone, only to pull back at the last moment. I questioned what reconnecting would mean, what it might open up inside me that I'd spent years trying to keep closed. But the urge to reach out grew stronger with each day, the need to understand him and, more importantly, to allow him to understand me. One evening, I finally found the courage to send him a message. It was a short note, just a simple invitation to grab coffee sometime if he was open to it. I agonized over every word, deleting and rewriting until I finally forced myself to press send. I was surprised by the wave of relief that followed, as though reaching out had lifted a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The next day, he responded with a simple, "I'd love that," and just like that, our next meeting was set. I suggested a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a quiet place I often visited when I needed time to think. As I waited for him to arrive, I felt a familiar unease, a strange blend of excitement and trepidation. The uncertainty gnawed at me, reminding me that reconnecting wasn't just about reliving old memories, it was about facing the ways we'd both changed. Acknowledging the years we'd lost and the people we'd become. When he walked in, he looked different. There was a calmness about him that I hadn't noticed before, a quiet strength that felt foreign yet strangely comforting. He smiled when he saw me, that same soft smile that had once felt so distant but now seemed more genuine, more real. As he took a seat across from me, I felt a warmth in his presence, an ease that I hadn't expected. We talked for hours, our conversation drifting from light topics to deeper, more personal reflections. We didn't dive into the heavy stuff right away somehow. We both knew that we needed to build trust, to find our footing before we could truly open up. He told me about the small things, the mundane details of his life that painted a picture of the man he'd become, his job at a local nonprofit, his love of hiking, the quiet weekends he spent exploring trails or reading by the fireplace. As he spoke, I could see the way he'd built himself from the ground up, crafting a life that was rich in ways our childhood home had never been. His voice held a calm certainty, a groundedness that I found myself admiring, even envying. I realized that he had created the stability we'd never known as children, carving out a place for himself in a world that had once rejected him. I shared parts of my life too, telling him about my work, my marriage, the sense of peace I'd found over the years despite the scars I still carried. It felt strange, talking to him as an adult, as though I was speaking to a friend rather than the boy I'd grown up with. And yet, there was a familiarity in our exchange, an unspoken bond that felt both fragile and strong, like a bridge slowly being rebuilt. As the conversation drifted into more personal territory, we eventually found ourselves talking about our parents, the elephant in the room that neither of us had dared to confront until now. He spoke of the fear he'd felt after coming out, the suffocating pressure of our parents' expectations and the shame they had tried to instill in him. Hearing him describe it brought back my own memories, the silent rage I'd felt, the helplessness that had haunted me for years. I told him about the guilt I'd carried, the years I'd spent blaming myself for not defending him, for not standing up to our parents. I admitted that part of me had always felt responsible for his suffering, as though I'd failed him when he needed me most. I hadn't planned to say it, but the words came spilling out, unguarded and raw, revealing a vulnerability I hadn't even realized I was still holding. He listened, his expression softening, and I could see a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He told me he'd never blamed me, that he'd known I was as much a victim of our parents' cruelty as he was. He assured me that his decision to leave had never been about abandoning me, that it had been a matter of survival, a desperate attempt to escape a life that felt like a prison. In that moment, something shifted between us. It was as though a dam had broken, allowing years of pent-up emotions to flow freely, washing away the resentment and pain that had kept us apart. We sat there, each of us quietly acknowledging the other's suffering, recognizing that we'd both done what we could to survive. By the time we left the cafe, I felt a sense of calm, a quiet understanding that I hadn't known before. I realized that forgiveness was no longer a question or a decision, it was simply a state of being. A natural outcome of the compassion we'd found for each other. The years of silence, the unresolved questions, the anger and guilt of it had faded into something softer, something almost sacred. Over the next few months, we continued to see each other, slowly rebuilding our relationship one conversation at a time. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old wounds flared up, when memories of our parents' cruelty would surface, bringing with them a flood of emotions. But we faced it together, each of us learning to navigate the scars we carried, finding comfort in the shared understanding that only we could provide. Our relationship took on a new depth, a quiet strength born from years of separation and the healing that had followed. We became not only brothers but friends, two people who had weathered the storm and come out the other side. Forever changed but forever bound. One day, after we'd spent the afternoon hiking a trail near his town, he asked if I'd be willing to visit our childhood home. The question took me by surprise, and at first, I wasn't sure how to answer. The thought of returning to that place filled me with a familiar dread, a reminder of the pain and trauma we'd both endured. But as I looked at him, I realized that this was part of our journey, a way of reclaiming the past, of facing the memories that had haunted us both. With a mix of fear and resolve, I agreed, knowing that whatever we found there, we'd face it together. Driving to our childhood home was like stepping into a time machine. The landscape felt eerily unchanged, as though the years hadn't touched it. The trees lining the narrow road, the quiet houses, the somber sky, it all looked the same, as though frozen in time, waiting for our return. As we approached, I felt the tension build in my chest, an old, familiar weight pressing down on me. I hadn't been back since the day I left, since I finally broke free from the suffocating grip of a place I'd once thought I'd never escape. We pulled up in front of the house, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The sight of it was jarring. The white paint was peeling, the lawn overgrown, the shutters hanging at awkward angles. Time had worn the house down in a way I hadn't expected, stripping it of the rigid, austere image that had once loomed over us. It was just an old, neglected building now, haunted only by our memories. My brother glanced at me, a question in his eyes. I nodded, bracing myself as we stepped out of the car. The air felt thick, heavy, with a silence that reminded me of the long, quiet days we'd spent inside those walls, afraid to disturb the stillness our parents demanded. We approached the front door, and as my hand reached for the knob, a wave of memories washed over me, each one pulling me back into the past. Inside, the house smelled of dust and stale air. The light filtering through the windows cast an eerie glow on the walls, illuminating the faded wallpaper and worn furniture. It was as though the house had preserved itself, keeping everything exactly as we'd left it, waiting for us to return. The silence felt oppressive, amplifying the weight of our memories as we moved through the rooms, each one bringing a new wave of recollection. The living room was the first stop. I remembered the countless hours we'd spent here, sitting stiffly on the couch, our hands folded in our laps as our parents drilled us on scripture, their voices stern and unyielding. My brother's face was unreadable as he looked around, his eyes lingering on the furniture, the old family Bible still sitting on the coffee table, as if our parents had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. We moved through the house in silence, neither of us willing to break the quiet that seemed woven into the walls. As we entered the hallway leading to our bedrooms, I felt a chill. This narrow corridor had always felt like a passageway between two worlds, the world of our parents' rigid control and the small, secret world we'd carved out for ourselves in the few moments of solitude we were granted. When we reached my brother's old room, he hesitated. I saw his hand hover over the doorknob, his fingers trembling slightly. I placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support as he opened the door and stepped inside. His room was much as I remembered, but smaller somehow, stripped of the life it had once held. The bed was neatly made, the furniture stark and unwelcoming, a reminder of the nights he'd spent alone, grappling with the secret he'd carried for so long. I could see the weight of those memories in his eyes as he looked around, his gaze distant. I wondered what he was seeing, if he was remembering the night he'd come out to me. The fear in his eyes, the shame he tried to hide. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I knew what this place had done to him, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, I just stood by him, sharing in the silence, letting him feel what he needed to feel. Finally, he turned to me, his expression somber yet calm. "This was my prison," he said quietly, "but I survived it. We both did." His words hung in the air, a solemn acknowledgement of the pain we'd endured, the resilience we'd found in each other. I felt a surge of gratitude, not just for him, but for the strength that had kept us both going, that had allowed us to find our way back to each other after all these years. We made our way to my old room next, and I was struck by how different it looked from my memory. The bed, the dresser, the small bookshelf, all of it felt foreign, as though it belonged to someone else. I'd left so much of myself behind when I walked out of this house. And now, standing here, I felt a strange detachment, as though I were an outsider looking in on someone else's life. The last stop was the small prayer room our parents had created at the end of the hall. A room filled with religious icons, crosses, and framed scripture. We'd been required to spend time here every evening, kneeling in silence, our hands clasped as we recited prayers under our parents' watchful eyes. I could still feel the ache in my knees, the strain in my back, the hollow emptiness that filled me as I repeated words I didn't believe. Words that felt like chains binding me to a life I couldn't escape. Standing there now, I felt the old anger rise up, the resentment I'd buried for years. I glanced at my brother, and I could see a similar emotion flicker in his eyes. We both knew the damage this place had inflicted on us, the scars it had left. But as we stood there, facing the relics of our past, I felt something shift. The anger began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet determination, a resolve to leave this place behind once and for all. Before we left, my brother reached up and took down one of the crosses from the wall, holding it in his hand as though it were a relic, a symbol of everything we'd endured. He looked at me, and I could see the decision in his eyes, a silent agreement that we would no longer be defined by the pain this place had caused us. Without a word, he placed the cross on the ground, leaving it behind as we turned and walked out of the room. As we stepped back into the hallway, I felt a strange sense of lightness, a feeling I hadn't known since childhood. We had faced our past, had walked through the memories we'd both tried so hard to forget. And in doing so, we'd reclaimed a part of ourselves that had been lost for so long. This house, with all its shadows and secrets, no longer had a hold on us. We were free. Outside, the air felt fresh and cool, a welcome contrast to the stale, suffocating atmosphere inside. My brother and I stood on the front steps, looking back at the house in silence. I felt a sense of finality, a quiet acknowledgement that this was the last time I would ever stand here, that I was ready to leave this place behind and move forward. My brother turned to me, his expression calm, a faint smile on his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for coming back with me, for everything." I nodded, feeling a swell of emotion I couldn't put into words. We had come full circle, had faced the darkest parts of our past and emerged stronger, bound by the resilience we'd found in each other. I knew that our journey wasn't over, that there would be more challenges, more healing to do, but in that moment, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that we were no longer defined by the pain of our past. As we drove away, leaving the house behind us, I felt a lightness in my chest, a freedom I hadn't known in years. I glanced at my brother, and he smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that seemed to erase the years of silence and separation. In the end, we had found something far more powerful than forgiveness. We had found acceptance. A quiet understanding that our past didn't have to define us, that we could build a future together, one free from the shadows of our childhood. And for the first time, I felt truly free, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, knowing that I was no longer alone. It's been several months since we visited our childhood home, and sometimes, I still catch myself marveling at how light I feel. That visit had been both a reckoning and a release, a final confrontation with the shadows that had haunted us for so long. After we left, I felt something shift inside me, as though the weight I'd carried all my life had finally lifted. I began to understand that our pain, while real and profound, no longer held the power it once did. My brother and I have grown closer in ways I once thought impossible. We talk regularly now, sometimes about the past but more often about the lives we're building now. Each conversation feels like another stitch in the fabric of our relationship, repairing what was once torn apart. We've found a rhythm, a mutual understanding that allows us to move forward without the burden of expectations or resentment. We've even begun to laugh about certain memories, little snippets of our childhood that used to feel painful but now carry a bittersweet nostalgia. The time he taught me to whistle under the threat of our parents' disapproval. The secret notes we'd write to each other and hide under the floorboard in the hallway. The late-night conversations we shared about the future we once believed would never come. Now, those memories are like treasures. Reminders of the bond that held us together, even in our darkest moments. I've found that the act of forgiving and understanding my brother has also allowed me to forgive myself. I no longer blame myself for the years we spent apart or for the ways I once felt I'd failed him. Instead, I see those years as part of a journey we both had to take. A winding path that led us back to each other in a way that feels both inevitable and miraculous. My wife has noticed the change in me too. She tells me that I seem lighter, happier, as though a part of me that had been missing has finally returned. It's true, I feel a peace that I've never known, a calmness that allows me to look forward without the constant pull of the past. Our marriage has deepened, and I find myself more grateful for her patience and understanding, for the quiet strength she offered me when I was still struggling to find my own. Occasionally, I still think about our parents. We haven't spoken since I left home all those years ago, and I doubt we ever will. I used to carry a lot of anger toward them, a resentment that gnawed at me even when I thought I'd moved on. But now, I see them for who they are, people shaped by their own fears and limitations. Bound by beliefs they couldn't escape. They were the source of our pain. Yes, but they were also prisoners in their own way, trapped by the rigidity of a worldview that left no room for love or compassion. I don't condone what they did to us, but I no longer feel consumed by my hatred for them. In a strange way, I've found a sense of pity for them, a recognition that they, too, were shaped by forces beyond their control. It doesn't excuse their actions, but it has allowed me to finally let go, to release the bitterness that once kept me tethered to them. I realize now that forgiveness isn't always for the one who hurt you, it's a gift you give yourself. A way of setting yourself free. Last weekend, my brother and I went hiking together. It's become a tradition of sorts, a way for us to connect outside the confines of our past. As we walked through the quiet trails, surrounded by the beauty of nature, I felt a sense of wholeness. A realization that life, for all its hardship and struggle, has a way of bringing us back to where we belong. At one point, we reached a clearing that overlooked the valley below, the sky wide and open above us. Standing there, I felt the years fall away, replaced by a quiet gratitude for this moment, for the journey that had brought us here. My brother stood beside me, silent, but I could see the same feeling reflected in his eyes, a sense of peace, of healing, of finally being home. We didn't need words. The silence between us was enough, a quiet testament to the bond we'd rebuilt, one forged not out of obligation or guilt, but out of genuine understanding and love. As we made our way back down the trail, I felt a profound sense of closure. I knew that our journey wasn't over, that there would be new challenges and memories to create, but I also knew that, whatever the future held, we would face it together, stronger and more whole than we'd ever been. In the end, our story isn't one of bitterness or loss, but of resilience, of two people who found their way back to each other despite the odds. It's a story of forgiveness, of learning to accept the past and finding the courage to move forward. And as I look toward the future, I feel a quiet confidence, a belief that, no matter what comes next, I am ready, because now, at last, I am free.